10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 253. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 253 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in yet again. We are getting into part 3 of our Miles Davis series. Before we jump into the show, just wanted to let you know that you can get all the PDF materials from this episode along with backing tracks and a lot of other fantastic jazz education material by supporting us with a small monthly donation on our Patreon site. This is a listener-supported show. You will notice there are no advertisements or anything like that. And the way that we stay alive is from listeners such as yourself that are looking to get better at jazz. So you can find that by going to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, clicking on one of the Patreon banners, get yourself signed up today, and you get access to every single PDF that we have ever put out here on the show. 253 episodes, so a lot of stuff over there. So I've got to give a shout out to a bunch of new patrons this week. Thank you to our new $3 patrons, Matthias and Agnieszka. Not going to lie, Agnieszka, I had to look up how to pronounce your name. I hope I did a good job, but thank you for signing up for Patreon. We also have some brand new $5 patrons. Thank you to Stephen, Jean, and Chris. And I also want to thank Ben for editing their pledge from $3 to $5. So welcome to all the new members, and thank you to everybody that has been a member for a long time. Again, you can get yourself signed up by going to 10minutejazzlesson.com, clicking on one of the Patreon banners, getting yourself signed up today for instant access. All right, so let's jump back into the topic at hand. So far this month, we've talked about Miles's use of diatonic notes over really complicated chord progressions, specifically over rhythm changes. And then last week's episode was all about space. What we're going to do in part 3 is we're going to go back to the diatonic thing because I feel that it is one of the most important aspects of playing. If you can learn to do more and really interesting things with less, without using any substitutions or altered notes, you can really bring your playing a long way. And then when you introduce those altered notes back in, you'll discover a whole world of opportunity without having to rely on those altered notes to make your solos sound cool. So last time we talked about this topic over rhythm changes, which is a really dense chord progression. This week, we're going to talk about it over the 2-5-1 progression, and specifically 4-measure 2-5-1 progressions. So these are chord changes that are much more spread out. They're not as dense, and I find it amazing that he still manages to use, in a lot of situations, purely diatonic notes, and he somehow manages to make them sound absolutely amazing. And the really striking thing is that you don't miss the flat 9s and the sharp 11s and the tritone substitutions and all that kind of stuff. You really don't miss it. These lines stand on their own 2 feet, and he really unabashedly uses just the diatonic notes, and we just don't miss any of that other stuff. He still manages to use tension and release. He still manages to use rhythm to his major advantage over this stuff. So for everybody that can't really wrap their head around this really advanced jazz theory, using the diminished scale, using the whole tone scale, using the altered scale, you really have no excuse for feeling helpless without that stuff. You really just need to practice more and use just diatonic notes. I think everybody that listens to this show is comfortable with some of the scales, and especially over 2-5-1. I'm guessing that everybody listens to this show understands the basic modes that we are using over a 2-5-1 progression. So maybe what you should do if you feel overwhelmed and you feel like you're drowning when you're trying to figure out more advanced topics is just try to figure out as much as you can do with diatonic notes. Limit yourself to that. Even people that don't feel handcuffed by the advanced music theory, that actually understand it, this would be a great exercise to do for part of your practice routine where you ignore all that stuff and you just play diatonic notes and phrases. I really do think that even though this is what a lot of people would consider quote unquote boring, it's not. It really is the key to being flexible with your soloing. Now, one more thought before we jump into the actual examples from this week. When I'm looking at these solos and transcribing these solos that I pulled some of these lines out of, it's not that he'll play an entire solo only using diatonic notes. It's the flexibility he has to sometimes play diatonically and then sometimes use really advanced language that makes him so great. So, sometimes I catch myself doing this in my own solos where I'll get into the frame of mind where I think over every single chord, I have to use the hippest, most advanced, most interesting language. And then when I listen back to my playing, it really subtracts from the impact of my solo if I'm doing that 100% of the time. The solos that I find I like the best that I've played myself and in the artists that I listen to are the solos where there's a really healthy balance between really inside stuff and then some advanced stuff. So don't fall into that trap and maybe use some of these lines and writing some of your own lines diatonically to get a little bit more of that inside language and do more with less. That's kind of my, I guess, take-home point from today's episode. Okay, so let's dive into the 3 examples that I've prepared for you this week. So the first 2 examples come from Miles' solo over Origin, and these are just over plain old major 2-5-1s, and they are both in the key of A flat major. So just 1 measure of B flat minor 7, 1 measure of E flat 7, and then 2 measures of A flat major 7. So let's listen to line number 1, and then we'll talk about it. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. One, two, 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so what we hear in that is, first of all, the first measure is really simple, just 3 quarter notes all inside of that mode. And then in the second measure, he does this really cool thing where he starts on the 6 of the dominant chord, and he literally just comes right down the scale all the way to the 4. And then when he resolves it on the downbeat of the 1 chord, he just goes up a whole step and resolves it to the 5th. Right? And then the rest of the 1 chord is all diatonic as well. So I think the takeaway from that first one, 2 things. The first measure is so simple. It's just 3 quarter notes all inside. And then the second measure is just a descending scale. No chromaticism, no anything. He's literally just coming down the scale. But he's thought about, okay, starting on the 6, I'm going to end up on the 4, and then he can resolve either to the 3rd or go back up to the 5th. And in this situation, he's gone up to the 5th. So I think that's the takeaway from line number 1. Let's jump into line number 2, which is the exact same 2-5-1 progression, but he plays something very different over this one. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. One, two, 1, 2, 3, 4. So did anybody catch that there is actually 1 chromatic note in this one? I still chose to include it because really 99% of it is diatonic. It's just that he uses 1 chromatic note to really nice effect, and that is on the and of 4 in the first measure. He uses a chromatic approach tone to hit the flatted 7th over the 5 chord. But this one has a very different texture than the first one, in my opinion. So one thing I want to talk about that's really specific is right in the first measure. What he's doing is on beat 2, he's doing an enclosure that lands on beat 3. So you'll see on beat 3 of measure 1, he plays the 6 of the 2 chord. And what he's doing is he's surrounding that. First, he plays the 7th on beat 2. Then he plays the 5 on the and of 2. And then he lands on that 6 on beat 3. And I think this is really cool because he's managed to do an enclosure only using diatonic notes. Typically, when we think about an enclosure, we think about, okay, a half step above to a half step below, and we land on that. What he's doing is he's going a half step above to a whole step below, and then he's landing on his target note, and it's still really effective. Really effective. So if you start to think, well, the only way I can do really cool stuff like enclosures and other bebop things is by using chromaticism, that's not true. You could still do some really cool devices and effects that you know without using chromaticism. You could do it by staying diatonic. Now, the other thing I want you to study in this is his masterful combination of half steps, whole steps, thirds, and fourths. So I want you to see how all of those different intervals interact and how he is sort of pacing his use of them when he uses a large jump as opposed to when he uses a half step or a whole step. And that part of this line is just masterful, all while staying diatonic, except for that one non-diatonic note on the and of 4 leading into 1 of the second measure. So I really love this line because on the surface, it doesn't seem like he's doing all that much, but we can find a lot to dive into in this second line. So check that one out on the PDF and really dissect everything that's going on. All right, here's the third and final line. This one is a 2-5 in the key of F minor and is from his solo on All of Me. All right, let's check this one out. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. One, two, 1, 2, 3, 4. So this one really strikes me as, first of all, being the simplest one out of the 3. It's so simple. He doesn't even really play any running eighth note lines. It is harmonically extremely, extremely simple. He just starts on the 9th of the 2 chord and literally comes down the diatonic scale, leading from that 9th down to the 3rd of the 5 chord. And then he just does this really brilliant, simple resolution to the 5th of the 1 chord. And it is just so wonderfully, brilliantly simple but effective. I think that this is kind of like the ethos of Miles Davis just summed up perfectly in this line. It's not complicated, it's not advanced, but when you hear it, it's just like one of the most beautiful, simple things that you've ever heard. So there's really not that much to talk about on this. It's just the fact that it's such a brilliant combination of simplicity and effectiveness. So take what you will from that third line, but what I want you to do is take a 2-5-1 progression and kind of just like the first episode of this series where I had you do this over rhythm changes, now the chords are going to be a little bit more spread out, and I want you to write, 3, 4, 5 examples of purely diatonic 2-5-1 lines and see if you can make them as interesting as possible using some of these concepts that we learn from Miles Davis. So let me know if you're having any trouble with that or you have any questions about this. You can get in touch with me in the Facebook group, the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson community, and you can also email me at 10minutejazzlesson@gmail.com. All right, that's going to about do it for this episode. I hope you are all having a wonderful March so far. You're staying safe and healthy out there. Hopefully this time period in our lives will be coming to a close sometime soon, and we could get back to some sense of normalcy. Remember, you can grab the PDFs to this episode at 10minutejazzlesson.com. Click on one of the Patreon banners, get yourself signed up for instant access. And I just appreciate all of you so much. Thank you for continuing to tune into this show week in and week out, and we'll keep them coming at you. All right, everybody, have a good weekend. Talk to you soon. Bye.